Hi, I'm Kate Livy, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I welcome you back to another fantastic summertime installment of Chesapeake Treasure, a feature here on Facebook where we explore one of the more than 68,000 objects in the museum's collections. So, every summer, many of you experience something that is either wonderful or terrifying, depending on who you are, which is a trip over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the William Preston Lane Memorial Junior Memorial Bridge. That Bay Bridge was built, believe it or not, 65 years ago this July, and was dedicated July 30th, 1952, which is something that I think plenty of people who are watching today can remember, but many of you may not know the cool history behind the Bay Bridge. But I'd like to start out with something really neat from our collections that we have, because the Bay Bridge has really been such an incredibly influential element to Chesapeake Bay culture, tradition, you name it. Maritime culture has been really impacted by the presence of this bridge. So we like to collect objects that relate to the bridge, and we have some pieces here from the collection of Menashe Katz. He was an aide to Governor McKeldin in the 1950s, and so he was able to collect some really unique objects relating to the Bay Bridge dedication. So if you come in a little closer, you can see what we've got here are a collection of dedication objects. There are two pieces of the ribbons that were cut on both the western shore and the eastern shore by Governor McKeldin and the previous governor, William Preston Lane Jr. And then you can also see that there are guest badges and ribbons, of course, with the Maryland state colors. Here we have a really wonderfully iconic photo, two 1950s convertibles, very stylish. Here we've got Governor McKeldin and William Preston Lane Jr. with their police escort all headed over the bridge for the first time. Up here we have a what's described in the collection's documents as an elegantly embossed dedication pamphlet here, and it says July 30th, 1952. This is a really neat piece. This is a ticket written out for the governor, stamped governor on the top, number 1, and it's good for one passage across the Chesapeake Bay Toll Bridge. So these are the types of tickets that are kind of predate Easy Pass. If you've got one of those on your car, you would get books of tickets like these at the little building next to the Bay Bridge tolls, and these tickets would be good for commuters, to get passage over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. And then here to the left, we have the invitation, Honorable Theodore L. McKeldin, the governor at the time, inviting Menashe Katz to the dedication ceremony. And you can see here it's the 30th of July, 1952. And down here it says that ceremonies begin at 10:30 a.m. on the western end of the bridge and are concluded at the eastern end at approximately 1:30. So there would have been two dedications, two openings on each side of the Bay Bridge span. Now, this is so wonderful to have in our collections because what the Bay Bridge is interesting, of course, but what is interesting also is how much went into actually getting it constructed. So for a long time, really since the 18th century, the transportation across the bay had largely been ferries. Originally, these might have been schooner packets. Later on, they became steamboats. And after that, as cars, in the early 20th century became more popular, you started to see car ferries. These were privately operated vessels that went across the bay. And I think often we sort of look back on the ferry system with some sort of rose-colored glasses, but it was actually pretty inefficient. By the 1930s, there was a lot of people who were really wanting to go to Ocean City, wanting to go to the beaches. They had more leisure time. Those beaches are particularly lovely. And to get there, you had to take the Annapolis Chesapeake ferry, and often wait for hours and hours. Now, I know it can feel like hours and hours if you're waiting in traffic to get across the Bay Bridge today, but compared to what you had to wait in the 1930s to get across the Bay Bridge, it ain't nothing. So there was really this impetus to get a Bay Bridge built that started in the 1930s, and in 1938 the State Highway commissioned this sort of state bridge committee, and the idea is that they were going to study the crossing. They contemplated a couple different routes. One was considered from Miller Island to Tolchester Beach in Kent County. Then, of course, there was the one from Love Point over to Kent Island. And then further south, they considered a connection between Calvert County and Dorchester. Now, the other two spans that they didn't go with were much longer. They were over 6 miles in length. So they ended up moving ahead with the idea to do the one between Love Point and Kent Island. However, all these plans were disrupted by World War II. And so while the country was at war, the plans were dropped to continue the Bay Bridge, and just steamboats continued up and down the bay and ferries as they had before. So it wasn't until 1949 that William Preston Jr., the governor at the time, was able to get work started again on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge that January. So it's January of 1949. And by July of 1952, the bridge was dedicated and was open for traffic for the first time. Now we've got another great image in our collection here. That shows we have Governor McKeldin in that really sexy little convertible. Here's his wife, believe it or not, Honolulu, gotta love that. And then here they're waving to the ferry, which is passing. You know, it really represents the past and the future combined in this photo. And the Bay Bridge would indeed spell the death knell of the ferry system in the Chesapeake. We have another image from 1949 or 1954. So that 2 years after the Bay Bridge was dedicated, in 1954 in December, this is the last ferry ride to head between the Eastern Shore and the Western Shore before the ferry closed for good. So it did spell the end of what had been a long history of ferry transportation over 200 years across the Chesapeake Bay. Now, if you cross the bay today, you recognize there's not just one bridge, though. And that's because very quickly, traffic on the Bay Bridge just started increasing to the point where it was backing up almost to the degree that the ferries had before. And that's because, you know, it's after World War II, it's the 1950s. This is sort of the boom of the car era. There's more and more families. You know, you've got the soldiers coming back from World War II, starting these large families. They want to go to vacation on the Eastern Shore and the Chesapeake Bay beaches. So in 1973, the second span of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge was completed. And this is an image from the 1980s by Constance Stewart Larrabee in our collections. And this represents a view that many of you will know, those two twin spans crossing the Chesapeake Bay, one going from the Western Shore, the other stretching to the Eastern Shore, both, westbound and eastbound here. And of course, if you've been paying attention, now those two bridges are often very busy in the summer. So now we're considering another span of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Probably not in the same location where it is today, but perhaps in one of the other two locations that they had considered back in 1908 when the conversation first opened about where to put the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So just a little history. If you happen to go over the Bay Bridge today or, in the next couple weeks as we enjoy the end of high summer, just say a prayer that you are not stuck in 5 hours of traffic waiting to get on a small car ferry to get to the Eastern Shore, and instead you get to enjoy the wonderful, thrilling, and maybe slightly sweaty palmed experience of driving over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So I hope you enjoyed learning today a little bit about a very iconic element on the Chesapeake Bay, and join us in a couple weeks for another feature of Chesapeake Treasure here on Facebook. Have a great day.